The hedgerow was 3 meters tall and older than anyone fighting near it. It had been growing since before the Norman conquest. Packed earth and root and hawthorn tangled into a wall that stopped vehicles, channeled infantry, and turned every field in this part of France into a compartment with its own geometry of survival. The crew of the Sherman on the lane's edge had been sitting behind it for 11 minutes. That was long enough to know that something was moving on the other side of the next field, long enough to have reported it, and long enough to understand that the next 30 seconds were going to require a decision. The loader had a round already seated. The gunner had the traverse set as far as the hedge would allow. The commander, standing in the cupola with the lid cracked, was listening to the sound of tracks that he had learned, through experience he had not asked for, to distinguish from the sound of his own vehicles. It was not one of his vehicles. He gave the order. The gun fired, and what happened next, whether the first shot had done enough, whether they moved in time, whether the loader got the second round in before the return fire arrived, depended on a weapon that had not existed in a Sherman turret 2 years earlier, a weapon that had no business fitting into that space. And that fit anyway because the people who made it work had decided that the alternative was worse. This was the Sherman Firefly, and its story is the story of a problem, an improvisation, and the brutal pragmatism of a war that could not wait for a perfect solution. By 1943, the mathematics of armoured combat in Europe had produced a problem that Allied tank planners could not ignore. The German army had fielded armoured vehicles whose frontal armour and long-range guns created genuine asymmetry in tank-on-tank engagements. The Panther and the Tiger represented different solutions to the German requirement for battlefield dominance, but they shared a characteristic that mattered most in practical terms. They were difficult to kill from the front at the ranges where encounters typically happened, and their own guns could reach Allied tanks at distances that stressed any reasonable defensive positioning. This was not an argument for German invincibility. Both vehicles had significant limitations, mechanical complexity, production constraints, maintenance demands, and tactical inflexibility that experienced Allied commanders learned to exploit. The mythology of the big cats has, in the decades since, grown larger than the operational reality warranted. But the reality was real enough. A crew in a standard Sherman encountering a Panther or Tiger at typical engagement ranges in northwest European terrain faced a genuine problem. The standard gun on most Sherman variants could not reliably penetrate the frontal armour of these vehicles at the distances that mattered. The calculation was not comfortable, and the crews who ran it knew the result. The British had a gun that changed the calculation. The 17-pounder had been developed as an anti-tank weapon of genuine capability, a gun that could engage the heavier German armour at practical combat ranges, with reasonable expectation of penetration. In towed form, it was already in service. The question was how to put it on a moving platform that could keep up with an armoured advance and engage targets that would not wait for a crew to unlimber and aim a towed gun. The obvious platform was a tank. The obvious tank, given the realities of Allied production and supply, was the Sherman. The problem was that the 17-pounder was not a gun that fit naturally into a Sherman turret. It was long, it was powerful in its recoil forces, and the ammunition it used was larger than the rounds the turret had been designed to stow and handle. Putting this gun into this vehicle required solving a series of engineering problems that were individually manageable and collectively demanding, and doing so under time pressure that did not allow for the kind of iterative development that a purpose-designed vehicle would have received. The men who performed that conversion worked within a set of constraints that would have discouraged a less determined effort. The deadline was the invasion of northwest Europe. The requirement was a gun capable of answering the heavy German armour. The platform was what was available. The work was done, the problems were solved one by one, and the result was a vehicle that was not beautiful and was not comfortable but was effective in the specific way that the situation required. The engineers who performed the Firefly conversion did not have the luxury of starting from a blank page. They had a Sherman turret. They had a 17-pounder. They had to make the second fit inside the first, function reliably, and leave a crew enough space to actually operate both during combat. The first compromise was space. The 17-pounder's breech was larger than the gun it replaced. When the recoil mechanism did its work and the breech moved rearward after firing, it occupied space that had previously belonged to the crew. The loader, working on the left side of the breech, found that the geometry of their task had changed in ways that required adaptation. movements that had been fluid became more constrained. The physical process of loading, taking a round from the stowage, positioning it, ramming it home was performed in a tighter envelope, and the consequence of doing it wrong was immediate and serious. The ammunition itself required a further compromise. The propellant cartridge for the 17-pounder was long enough that it could not be stowed in the conventional upright orientation that the Sherman's original ammunition racks used. The solution was to separate the propellant from the projectile and stow them in different positions, which worked, but which added a step to the loading process, and meant the loader was managing two components rather than one under conditions that already demanded speed and accuracy. The radio operator's position, which in the standard Sherman sat in the hull alongside the driver, was removed to create additional ammunition stowage in the hull. This was a practical solution to a practical problem, but it meant the Firefly operated with a crew of 4 rather than 5, and that the remaining crew members absorbed the workload the 5th had carried. None of these compromises made the Firefly a comfortable vehicle to fight from. The loader's physical environment was demanding in a way that accumulated over the course of a long day's operations. The intimacy of the working space meant that communication happened at a volume and immediacy that left no margin for ambiguity. When the gun fired and the 17-pounder firing inside a tank turret was an event of considerable force, the crew felt it completely. And yet the gun worked. The ammunition stowage worked. The crew learned to work the system at a rate that, while not the fastest achievable in a more accommodating vehicle, was fast enough for the engagements the Firefly was designed to win. The fourth element of the Firefly's design equation was the chassis it had started from. The Sherman's mechanical reliability was not incidental to the Firefly's value, it was central to it. A more capable gun on a less dependable platform would have produced a vehicle that spent more time being repaired than engaging targets. The Sherman's engine and drivetrain were not the most advanced available, but they were robust, well understood by the mechanics who maintained them, and supported by a logistics system that had been built around keeping them running. When the Firefly was ready to fight, it was usually actually ready to fight. That practical dependability, unremarkable in itself, was worth more in operational terms than specifications suggested. The maintenance crews who kept the Fireflies running were part of the vehicle's operational capability in a way that the records of individual engagements sometimes obscure. A tank that breaks down before reaching the objective is a tank that has failed its crew regardless of how capable its gun might have been on arrival. The Sherman's mechanics were familiar, the parts were available, the techniques were practiced. In the logistical environment of a sustained campaign across Northwest Europe, these qualities were not secondary considerations, they were primary ones. The Firefly's fifth design consideration was one that the engineers had not fully anticipated, but that the crews discovered quickly. The vehicle announced itself. The 17-pounder barrel was longer than the standard Sherman gun by a considerable margin. From any angle that allowed comparison, a Firefly was identifiable as something different from the Shermans around it. In a mixed unit, and Fireflies were typically distributed among standard Shermans rather than concentrated in separate units. The longer barrel was visible to any observer paying attention. German tank crews and anti-tank teams learned to identify the Firefly's profile. Accounts from the period describe the tactical response. When a mixed group of Shermans appeared, the priority target for the German side was the vehicle with the long gun. Kill the Firefly first, and the remaining Shermans reverted to a threat level that German armour could manage more comfortably. This created a tactical problem that had a tactical solution. Firefly crews used the terrain hedgerows, buildings, hull-down positions to conceal the length of the barrel. They relied on the coordination with standard Shermans to present the enemy with multiple targets simultaneously, complicating the target priority decision. Some crews went further, using camouflage or applying paint schemes that blurred the visual distinction between the Firefly's longer barrel and the standard gun. The measures were improvised and imperfect, but in the terrain of Normandy and the Low Countries, imperfect concealment was often enough. The tactics that emerged from this necessity were not written in advance. They developed from the practical experience of crews who encountered the targeting priority problem and worked out solutions in the field. The results were folded back into unit practice, shared through the informal channels that wartime armies use to transmit useful knowledge faster than official doctrine can be revised. If you're following this story, the improvisation, the engineering under pressure, the tactical adaptation that turned a problematic upgrade into a battlefield answer, consider subscribing. There's more to come on the vehicles and decisions that shaped the Second World War, Let us return to the hedgerow and the crew who had 11 minutes to wait. The Firefly's tactical value was realized most directly in the specific kind of engagement that the Norman bocage produced. Sudden, short, decided quickly, at ranges where the first shot carried disproportionate weight. In open country with long sight lines, the advantage of a longer-ranged, higher-velocity gun expressed itself over distance. In the bocage, where fields were small and hedgerows channeled movement into predictable lanes, the advantage expressed itself differently. It was not primarily about who could shoot furthest. It was about who could make the first shot count. The German armour that operated in Normandy had frontal protection that made the first shot from a standard Sherman a probability calculation rather than a certainty. Against the heavier vehicles, the first shot from a standard gun at typical bocage ranges might not produce the result needed, and the engagement might not last long enough for a second shot to be delivered under favourable conditions. The 1 7-pounder changed that calculation. At the ranges that bocage terrain produced, a round from the Firefly's gun had the penetration to address the frontal protection of the heavier German vehicles with considerably more confidence than the standard alternative. Not with certainty the geometry of an engagement, the angle of impact, the specific variant of vehicle, all introduced variables that no gun specification could eliminate, but with enough reliability that the tactical math shifted. The crews who understood this fought accordingly. The Firefly was positioned for the shot it was best suited to take. The standard Shermans in the same unit operated in coordination, pressing, manoeuvring, presenting the enemy with multiple demands on attention, while the Firefly held a position that allowed it to engage the target that most needed its specific capability. This was combined arms thinking applied at the smallest scale. Within a single troop or squadron, different vehicles performing differentiated roles, the whole more capable than any of its parts would have been operating independently. The Firefly did not make the standard Sherman irrelevant. It made the standard Sherman more dangerous by providing it with a partner that could answer threats the Sherman could not answer alone. The loader's experience inside the Firefly during a serious engagement was not an experience that left much room for reflection at the time. The sequence of actions required acquiring a round from the modified stowage arrangement, handling the separated propellant, positioning both components for loading, completing the cycle, confirming ready, managing the spent case as it ejected was a physical routine, performed in a space that offered bruises as readily as it offered working room. The heat accumulated. The noise of the gun firing was not something the body stopped responding to simply because it was expected. What accounts from the period consistently describe is the degree to which the crew functioned as a coordinated system rather than as individuals performing separate tasks. The commander's calls set the sequence. The gunner's tracking kept the gun on target through the movement and adjustments that followed the shot. The loader's routine had to integrate with both, without interruption, under conditions where interruption could be fatal. The Firefly's loading was slower than a gun better suited to the turret would have been. The crews knew this. They managed it by making the first shot matter more by positioning for the engagement, by holding fire until the solution was as good as the situation allowed, by coordinating with the rest of the unit to ensure the Firefly's shot came from a position of advantage rather than reaction. The system worked well enough, often enough, in enough of the engagements it was asked to decide, that the Firefly became something the British armoured force considered essential rather than auxiliary. On the other side of those hedgerows, the reaction to the Firefly's presence was something that accumulated through the summer of 1944 into a specific kind of operational awareness. German armoured units that had operated against Allied tank formations with a degree of confidence in the frontal protection of their heavier vehicles began to encounter a different situation. Accounts from the period describe the recalibration that followed, engagements where Sherman's vehicles that should, by the calculation in use, not have presented the threat they were presenting produced hits that defeated the protection the German crews had been relying on. The effect was not simply the physical result of more penetrations. It was the operational uncertainty that came with no longer being certain which vehicles in a Sherman formation carried the gun that changed the equation. When every Sherman in a group might or might not be a Firefly, the tactical calculus for the German side required caution that consumed time and initiative. And in armoured combat, caution that consumes time is caution that concedes advantage. The Firefly was not the only factor in the summer's armoured engagements. Allied air power, artillery, logistics, numerical advantage, and the accumulated attrition of German armour over 4 years of war all contributed to the campaign's eventual outcome. Assigning to any single vehicle type a definitive role in that outcome would overstate the case. But within the specific context of tank-on-tank and tank versus anti-armour engagements in northwest Europe, the Firefly changed what British armoured units could credibly attempt. It provided a gun that could answer the threat that the heavier German armour represented, on a chassis that the logistics system could support, in numbers that were meaningful, with crews who had been trained to use the vehicle's specific capability deliberately rather than relying on it incidentally. The numbers of Fireflies produced and deployed were significant within the British Commonwealth armoured order of battle. They were not dominant. Fireflies fought alongside considerably more standard Shermans and other tank types, and the conversion had its limits in terms of how many could be produced from available hulls and guns. But the distribution was wide enough and the deployment consistent enough that the Firefly's presence was a routine feature of British armoured operations from Normandy through the advance into Germany in 1945. The Sherman Firefly did not end the war. No single vehicle type ever does. What it did was solve a specific problem at the scale required in the time available. The problem was a gun that could reliably engage German heavy armour. The scale required was the British Commonwealth Armoured Force. The time available was the summer of 1944, not the theoretical future date when a purpose-designed vehicle might have been ready. The lesson in that sequence is not glamorous, but it is consistent with how wars are actually decided. The side that wins is not always the side with the best designed equipment. It is often the side that can take what it has, identify what needs to change, make the change at scale within the time available, and put trained crews into the modified vehicles before the window closes. The Firefly was not an elegant answer. The loader knew that. The commander knew that. The engineers who performed the conversion knew that. The turret was too small for the gun. The gun was too large for the turret. The ammunition was awkward. The barrel was too long to hide easily. And when the engagement at the hedgerow required a gun that could reach across the field and answer the threat on the other side of it, none of those complaints were relevant. What was relevant was that the gun was there, in a running vehicle, with a trained crew who knew how to use it. That was the Firefly. Not perfect. Not designed from the start for the role it filled. Not remembered with the reverence of vehicles that arrived earlier, or looked more imposing. But present and capable, at the moment the capability was needed. In a war decided by margins, that was enough.